Good morning. I'm Dan's partner, Don Mahoney. And to kind of pick up the story a little bit, I thought it might be worth sharing with you my experience and how I came into this organization with Dan. Dan showed up on my doorstep. I'm an architect. I was practicing architecture the way that most architects practice. I am a portfolio. I was a portfolio-based architect, which means it was my job to protect my body of work from you clients who were always trying to change my designs. And that was really the perspective that I held, the way that most architects think. For many years, I had been practicing, largely doing a lot of churches. I'm a Christian. I attend an evangelical free church in Salt Lake City. And I had done a large number of churches, probably all the wrong way, gotten into multiple, I say discussions, I would say arguments. The relationships were friction-filled, the way that most construction and architectural projects oftentimes are. Well, I ran into Dan through a relationship. When Dan referred to getting that school built in 1995, the following year he decided that he was going to set aside all of his secular clients and he was going to go out on a national basis and build schools. And because of a relationship that he held with an old friend of mine from church, Dan ended up at my doorstep and gave me all of the clients that he was working with. And so I was the recipient of his decision to go out on a national basis and see these schools get built. And frankly, I thought that he would be back in 3 or 4 months, 5 months, looking for his old clients because I thought he'll never make a living doing Christian schools. Churches weren't even on the radar screen, but if he had said at the time, I'm going to go out and do churches, I would have said the same thing. You'll be back in 4 or 5 months because you can't stand the financial conditions that surround doing these kinds of projects, and you can't stand all the arguing. Churches and schools are tough. Their committees are tough. The whole basis behind these things are tough because the money's tough. Pastor Chico told us this morning that you might as well just accept the fact that there's going to be difficulties raising funds and issues and challenges and so forth. That's the understatement of the morning. There's all kinds of issues in terms of raising money, but there's all kinds of opportunities for faith there as well. And at the time, I thought, well, he'll be back shortly. The whole notion of the Building God's Way movement had not really begun yet. Dan had accepted this challenge that he felt, and I think he would describe it as a calling to go out and do this. And so he did. He left. He deposited these client relationships in my lap. I continued on. I actually made a very good living doing that. One particular client that he gave to me, I've done 70 buildings for. I did 300,000 square feet of their corporate center. It was a very lucrative exchange that he offered to me, and I was very grateful for that, and off he went. But I ran into Dan a few years later. At the time, I had heard that he was involved in an organization called Building God's Way, and I really wasn't sure what that meant, and I have to tell you and be honest with you this morning, my first response to the name Building God's Way was, who would ever name their company Building God's Way? How did that happen? And I thought, what kind of a special dispensation does Dan, and I didn't know Dan real well. I knew him from a few introductory meetings and from some times that he had passed on these client relationships to me, but I didn't really know him that well. And I thought, boy, he's really gone off the deep end here. He thinks he's got some kind of a special dispensation from God. And so I met Dan at a conference about 11 or 12 years ago, and as a result of that meeting, he invited me to come up to his offices. I live in Salt Lake City. My office was in Salt Lake City. I had 25 architects working for me in my office. We were doing some great contracts. My portfolio was looking good. I had some of the greatest photographs of some of the greatest projects, a lot of performing arts centers and so forth. And I'll tell you, that was my identity. My identity was my fame, was this embodiment of work that I had created. And that's the way that architects think. That's the way that I thought. And so I went up to be polite and spend a morning with Dan and just see what he was doing, maybe grab some lunch, and then get out of Ogden and back to Salt Lake. In Utah, it's, I think I've heard this expression before, it's 30 miles from Ogden to Salt Lake City. It's 300 miles from Salt Lake to Ogden. We just don't go there. And so I went up there and I spent some time with Dan that morning, and actually I spent about 6.5 hours with him that day, walking around, meeting individuals who had a very different sense of purpose in their life, who were conjoined with general contractors like Erickson Hall all around the nation. There were 25 general contractors on a regional basis around the nation, and they were doing projects all over the place. And this little organization that Dan had gone out to found had blossomed into something that was completely off the radar screen. I was the incoming president that year of the American Institute of Architects for the state of Utah, and thought I had my finger on the pulse of all the offices in the state. I walked in that morning to the largest office in the state of Utah, and I didn't even know they existed. But I have to tell you that I still had this chip on my shoulder about the whole name Building God's Way. I thought, how could you have done that? How could you have named your company Building God's Way? And so we went through the day. I was seeing extraordinary ways of getting things done in a much more cooperative way, and things done where he was finding values that I couldn't touch on the projects that I was doing. I was a hard bid guy. I felt like we needed to hard bid everything and go for the lowest possible price and then fight our way through the change orders. You referred to change orders this morning? They can be tenaciously aggravating to an owner. To an architect, they're a challenge. And to me, they were always, that's why I sort of assigned myself the role of pit bull on the project, to go after the contractor on these change order amounts. And so I was probably the antithesis of a cooperative architect. I was an argumentative architect. But I felt like that was my role, that was my identity, and I was there to protect my portfolio and the client's money. And so, but I was seeing that morning something very different, much more cooperative way of getting things built, in buildings that were getting built for 20 and 30% under typical market-driven competitive rates. And I wasn't sure how that was happening. What Dan didn't say in that video, by the way, was that he got that school built for about 25% of the normal cost of a school. It's not a cheap school. He didn't use cheap materials. He used relationship building to create the methods that ended up being utilized on that project in order to make that project happen. He got the land donated. I mean, it was just constant prayer all the way through that project. The land was donated, the masonry package was donated, the sheetrock package was donated, concrete was donated. They had people fighting from the porta potty companies to get on that site for free. They had, if you look in the porta potty phone book, you'll see A, double A, triple A, quadruple A. They all want to be at the top of the list, and they were fighting to get on that site. And he just had the blessings of the Lord spilled out onto this project. Well, I was seeing this when I was in his office, and at the end of the day, he sat down and he said, "So, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, it's pretty incredible. I didn't really expect to see anything that I've seen today." And he said, "Well, are you ready to stop what you're doing and come join me in this?" And I said, no. Have you seen my portfolio? Have you seen what I'm doing? You know, I've got this office. I've been building this office for 14 years. It's a great office. I'm doing all this great work. And no, I said, I'm up here to steal some good ideas and then get back to Salt Lake. And he said, "Well, how about if I train a couple of your guys in how we do things, and then you make an assessment?" So I sent Mark Grable and Kurt Danitz. Kurt had been the director of design and construction for Long Beach State University for 4 years, and then had moved up to Utah and had come into my office. And so I sent those two fellows up to Ogden for a month just to learn this process of how to forge relationships that would be God-honoring relationships, that would be the sorts of things that we could really learn from, and then maybe employ those things in my own practice. I really wasn't thinking at the time. Well, I started going out on design charrettes, so on and so forth, and things changed. But I do remember that day I said, "Dan, I have to tell you, I can't get past the name of your company. I don't know why you would name your company Building God's Way." And I said, "I don't understand why you think you have some kind of special dispensation from God." And he didn't react in anger, which was good. He just looked at me and smiled, and he said, "It's because this company, this organization, stands for two primary things." He said, "Number one, stewardship. That's biblically mandated for these projects. If you want to go out and waste money on a city library or a bank or a fire station, whatever, that's not a problem. But in a project like this, where we have limited amounts of resources, Biblical stewardship is absolutely a biblical principle that we're going to follow. And he said something else. He said, now Dan happens to be an architect who's also a general contractor. He kind of wears two hats, which is odd. And he said, as an architect contractor, before he had become a Christian in 1986, Dan had worked on something in the neighborhood of 100+ different churches for different Christian organizations in the Intermountain region. And he said, not one single time did anybody ever share Christ with me. Not one time. They used me, they used my subs, they argued with me, they got what they needed, they dispensed of me. And he said, I think that we have an opportunity to raise the awareness of the light of Christ through our lives on these job sites. Well, that kind of hit me right between the eyes, because at the time, I had gone through Campus Crusade. I accepted Christ in college at the university. But when I got into professional practice, I distinguished very clearly between my life with Christ on the weekends and my life as the architectural pit bull during the week. And I had just come back from my first short-term missions trip to Cuba, and I thought, interesting. So at that point, I'm not a bang-bang type decision maker. I thought about it for some time. I had my guys come up and train, and I realized that there is a better way to get these projects done. That's God-honoring, that is attentive to stewardship, and where the church can be employed to minister to the people that come onto the site and to the people that will supply these projects. And in so doing, God will bless these projects. And I've watched it hundreds of times now. So, this morning, we're going to turn our attention to some of the things that we've noticed. We've been involved now in over 600 ministry-based projects over the last 15 years. It started off slowly, but then things began to ramp up, and we started to go through a rapid growth process. And we learned a lot about churches. You mentioned that architects and contractors don't really understand church. You're right. We don't. But we've learned. We've learned some things that have taught us the right ways and the wrong ways to do things. And there's all kinds of unique aspects to different churches. There's no question about it. I served as an elder, as a chairman of an elder board for my own church, and I learned things in that experience that taught me that I was able to apply to the things that I do professionally now in the world of design and construction. And so I've learned to think more like those that are ministering the gospel of Christ to their communities. And so we've learned a lot of things about how to do things and how not to do things. We've noticed trends. We've noticed what works and what doesn't work. We have the unique opportunity, too. We've done hundreds of these kinds of seminars around different parts of the nation. We've worked internationally. We've seen things in South America. I've worked in New Zealand and Canada. We've seen things all over the place, and there's a lot of commonalities that we're beginning to understand. And our focus has shifted towards how do we utilize facilities to the extent that we can to provide a better vehicle for spreading the gospel. How do we do that? How do we attend to the kinds of things that we need to? The little example that you gave this morning is the tip of the iceberg for us. We have noticed hundreds of things. And so this morning, I'm going to turn our attention. Are we ready to go, Tobias? One of the things that we've noticed is that in the United States today, that the church has really lost its sense of relevancy. That there is challenges on every front as to whether the church really even matters. You can debate the reasons why, whether that had to do with political integration that occurred in the 80s and the 90s of the church into mainstream America, whether the press and the media was a factor in all of that. I don't know all the reasons. I do know that when I toured Europe, I saw a disintegrated church, that the congregations, those body of believers, were fractured, that they weren't there. And I see America moving largely towards those kinds of things. And so one of the challenges today is how do we even become relevant? That's one of the things. How do we integrate and form community? It's a very important aspect. 20% of Americans claim absolutely no religious affiliation. It's one of those things where this term has popped up, the nuns. I don't know if you've heard of that, not N-U-N-S, the N-O-N-E-S, the nuns, where there's a large percentage of people. Well, that 20% doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a huge increase over what it's been in recent years. Those numbers have tripled in recent years. There seems to be the religion built on having no affiliation. That's the sort of thing that's begun to emerge. We're starting to deal with this new generation. This new generation is coming into their own. This is a generation, I'm from the baby boomer generation. I was born in 1957. I came from a generation of 74 million. This is a generation of 83 million documented. They think perhaps somewhere in the neighborhood in excess of 100 million. And the baby boomer generation was a huge generation. The war was over with, and all of a sudden the births were plentiful, and that generation was very strong, very long-lasting from 1946 to 1964. Large generation and very powerful, influential, and affluent generation. My generation, a generation of workaholics, which describes my life. 60, 70-hour work weeks, willing to sacrifice money instead of service. This generation, not so much. This generation has looked at that previous generation and said, a generation of hypocrites, a generation of people who did not form authentic community, shunned community, formed country club churches, isolated themselves, and began to fight for their rights. This generation is saying, we're not like that. We're forming differences. They're right. We're a generation of hypocrites. So are they. God tells us that. We just haven't realized it yet. We all have the sin natures. But at the end of the day, we have a generation that thinks and acts very differently. A generation that is very much tied to technology, wants to use technology for every aspect of their life. A generation that is very much attracted to fun, energetic environments. I remember the first time I was actually working on a Lutheran church up in Mission Viejo. I don't know if you were sitting at the table with me, Don, that day, but I was sitting with 4 or 5 of the millennial staff members and asking them, what is your church service like? And these 3 or 4 folks that were sitting at the table with me said, well, it's really fun. I remember thinking, fun? What does fun have to do with it? You know, why does church have to be fun? And I think what they were saying to me was, we want joy in our worship service, which is what the Bible tells us worship is supposed to be. It's rejoicing. That's the word for worship. So this is a generation that's wanting to return to that. It's a generation that is seeking authentic community from a generation that shunned community, that became isolationists. It's changed the way housing is done. It's changed the way our buildings are done. It's changed the way a lot of things that we think about things. 43% drop-off in church engagement between teen and early adult years. The problem is, that's been historic. That's been true of a lot of previous generations. The problem is that this generation is not coming back. Number one, they're not marrying in the same proportions. They don't have the firm belief in the institution of marriage. And when they do get married, they're not returning to church when they have children, when they get married. And so this generation is not coming back. And for us, the real challenge, too, in many regards, is the changing dynamics of church giving. Again, they don't believe in using money as a substitute for service. And so they look upon giving money as anathema. They don't focus their priority of their life on work, and so they don't make as much money. It's a difference in the way that these generations think. We also understand, too, that facilities it can be a response to some of the issues that we are facing. It is not the only answer. Facilities have limitations. We are wise enough to understand in a lot of situations that we'll walk in and the church is trying to substitute a facility answer for perhaps a larger endemic problem. And that's where a lot of things that Terry's going to talk about is in those kinds of circumstances, as architects and builders, we are often trying to steer the church away from a building project, ironically, and towards something that's more sustaining for them. Eventually, the building project becomes a response to a healthy church. We want to make sure that if we're working with somebody, they're not using a building project in a false way. I remember when I was in college, I worked for a couple of my professors doing large custom homes. So I would go to school in the day, and at night I'd run over and get some drawings done for these large custom homes. And oftentimes, because of the work patterns, the people that we were building the homes for would come in for nighttime meetings, and I'd be over there in the corner drawing while my boss was meeting with them. Well, 3 of the first 5 homes that I worked on ended in divorce before they ever even got the building out of the ground. And the reason is because they looked at a building project as a substitute for a bad marriage. They thought, well, we'll just unify around this building project. If you're having problems in your church and the building project is not a response to an active, vital ministry, don't build a building. Don't remodel a building, don't purchase a building, don't do that. We want to make sure that you're healthy, that you understand. And so this organization is committed to really partnering with you and understanding. And if you're not ready, there's some things that can be done in order to prepare yourself. So Terry will talk a little bit more about preparing your church and how we take a look at that. We're going to focus a little bit of time this morning just talking about the characteristics of millennials and how facility design and good master planning can help engage that group of people. This is a little bit different tack in the past. In the past, our church buildings represented the institution of church. And so the buildings tended to have a common thematic idea behind them. When I travel in the South, I see the big gable churches with the 4 white columns out front. It's what the folks in my office, the millennials in my office, call phony colony. They don't relate to the institutional aspect of a building. In fact, this generation is fleeing institutions. This society is fleeing institutions. So the things that sort of rooted us to community in the past are no longer true, and the way that they're exemplified in our buildings is no longer true. It's changing. So we're going to talk about some of these characteristics of these folks. I mentioned a few of the differences in the way that they think. One of the aspects that is very interesting to tap into is this whole notion of greater purpose. You can see this in the way that retail has branded things. You can go out and buy a pair of shoes now, and you can buy a pair of shoes that has a greater sense of purpose, that is taking a little bit of the money that you're paying for those shoes and going off to another place to people that don't have access to shoes and giving money for their shoes. That's very important to a millennial. My generation, not so much. We're suspicious. We don't trust that. We don't believe that that's accurate or that's true. And we don't, frankly, care, but this generation cares. This is something that's very important for us to understand, that we want to give something back, that we're being socially responsible, that the organization with which that we do business that is actually fulfilling a charitable mission, right? Really important. I have a hard time understanding that. I have a hard time, I've got kids that are in age from 24 to 29, and I know that they're living on a shoestring, and they're out there buying $4 lattes because they know a small portion of that is going to this certain organization in town that's feeding somebody. And I'm thinking, how can you afford to do that? It's because their mind is built around the notion of there's a community responsibility that's linked to the purchases and the direction of all the things that I do in my life. That's the way that they think. This whole this company, People Water, is selling bottles of water. It doesn't really work for us to just say, well, we're going to go get a drink out of the tap and send our $1.50 for our bottle of water off to this organization. We instead link the purchase of that bottle of water to the groups that are sustained by that bottle purchase. So the notion of greater purpose. Well, we've figured out, we found an organization, actually I think they found us, a Dominion Coffee Trading Company, that purchases coffee from an organization in Ethiopia that sponsors 200 some odd pastors in Ethiopia for missions outreach. Well, Dominion Coffee has become a huge linkage point in churches nowadays. And so we found an organization that is now linking ministry opportunity to the purchase of coffee. They'll have to tell you more. You can get on their website and find out a little bit more about it. But this is something that the millennial generation is clicking right into. It's not just enough for them to go to church and get a cup of coffee before or after church. They want to know that that cup of coffee has a direct linkage to ministry. Very important for us to think about. Well, now Dominion Coffee has come in and trained us about the proper way to set up coffee bars and coffee counters and places to dispense that sort of thing within churches. We were doing it all wrong before. We were trying to set them up like Starbucks. You can't do that. The Starbucks setup doesn't work for a church. When you suddenly release 500 people from a room like this and they go descend, Starbucks never has to deal with 500 people walking into their door at the same time. But churches do. They have to think intelligently about the way that they prepare and dispense those kinds of things. And Dominion's really helped us understand that. At the same time, they found a linkage. The two guys that started this organization came out to Utah to speak to us about this, and all of this started for them on a missions trip. They ended up going to Ethiopia on a missions trip and figuring out, wait a minute, there's people growing some of the best coffee in the world here who are in a need of support, and there's churches in America who are in need of coffee. Let's link these two together. And for the millennial mindset, that's a hugely important aspect of how to do things. Well, what are the implications to design? How does your church and building and land communicate with the fact that there's a sense of greater purpose to your organization? One of the things that's really important these days is how is your building being used by the outside community? What are the kinds of things that are happening inside your building? We learned this from an organization just up the road here in Chula Vista, a church that we did a few years ago that Erickson Hall built. They were getting taps, phone calls, connections all over the place about, can we come in and use your building? And the standard church answer to that is no, 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 no. Our staff is not set up to use that, to do that sort of thing. We can't be here at 9 o'clock at night locking up the building or unlocking the building at odd hours. Well, they finally realized that the outside community was really looking for a way to get in and form connections inside their building. And so they turned it around, assigned some staff time, and figured out that we can get 1,200 people a week that don't go to this church to come in the doors of this building, and we can begin to form those linkages. So they're now a community center. They've become a de facto community center. Does your facility promote environmental stewardship? There's a big movement that's racing through the United States these days, the LEED movement. You get a LEED certification. You can get either silver or gold or platinum. A lot of that stuff is political correctness, mumbo-jumbo. But what churches do care about is they care about the way that energy is utilized in their facilities, because every dollar you're going to spend on heating or cooling or supplying power for lighting is dollars that have to be raised that are not going directly into ministry. Those are sidebar expenses. And so from our position, we are remiss if we don't think hard about the way that energy is utilized in these facilities. And you know what? The millennials care about that. It's really important. The colleges that we're working for, we work with a large number of college institutions around the nation, Christian colleges here and there, and those kids come in for a recruiting trip, and one of their questions is, what are you doing on this campus for environmental stewardship? What are you doing to save energy? My kids are going to be on this planet someday. I want to know that you're contributing towards the environmental aspects of what's going on in your community. So it's really, really important. Another trend that we've seen that's been very interesting is the whole notion of foodscaping, of using land on the church property, not just for pretty landscaping that has to be maintained, but giving it over to the community, allowing it to be used for community garden usage, allowing the people in the church to come in and raise vegetables and raise things, and then give those vegetables and give that back out to the community for free or extremely low cost. The whole notion of using land in a wiser way has become a trend that we've noticed. Large amounts of churches that we've worked with have huge tracts of land that sit fallow, or they plant them with lawns and then go out and spend a huge part of their budget maintaining those lawns all the time. So are there smarter ways that we can do that? A lot of this stuff, by the way, we're learning from the fellows that are in our office, the interns in our office that have seen these kinds of things and understood what's important to this generation. So premium coffee that gives back, really important for us to be thinking about. The second thing we're going to talk about is the fact that this generation, to them, aesthetics matter. Not so much to previous generations. They would go to a church because it looked like a church. What we hear now is, we're ready to build a building, please don't make it look like a church. They're saying, we don't want phony colony. We don't want whatever the denominational signals are to the community. We don't want that. If it's there, we want it subtly. We will be more than happy to put a cross on our building, to let it stand for Christ, but at the end of the day, what people are asking for is, we want our building to look like a community center. Make it open. Don't make it closed. Don't shut it off. Make it open. Make it look like it's welcoming. Aesthetics matter. This generation is more than any other generation in the past, is more likely to make a purchase based on aesthetics of the package that the product comes in, which is amazing to me. Maybe it's because I'm a cheapskate. I don't understand that, but I'm looking not so much for the package, I'm looking for what's inside the package. This generation doesn't get past the package. The package is very important for them to think about. So incorporating design elements that are relevant to this generation are hugely important. Avoiding things that in the past have become signals to the whole notion of institution. Using products in a very different way. I was in a church recently and I saw, I don't know if you're familiar with what architects call OSB board, oriented strand board, wafer board. You go down to the lumber yard, you buy this stuff for $8 or $9 a sheet. It's cheap, you use it as underlayment, you use it as shear panels behind the finished skin of the building. I saw this stuff all over the inside of this lobby space and then covered with lanolin dyes just to change the color. So using products that are not necessarily made for their intended original use in new, creative, innovative, stewardship-minded ways. That's something that this generation clicks into a lot. They understand that. They want to see some kind of a creative way to do that, using different angles and in the way that varieties of shapes and forms work on the outside of the building. The whole notion of creating very strong entry, I think, is still important for churches, making sure that people don't get confused about where we go in the door on this building, but make it apparent from the street. Make it full of glass so people can see inside. Don't close yourself off. Don't shelter yourself from the outside. Very, very important. Simple shapes. A lot of descriptions that we hear a lot of days from different organizations is the whole notion of warm industrial, is creating warm industrial space. Space that I think to some extent, when I read between the lines of what they're saying, is they're saying, give us honest space with integrity. Simple, honest space with integrity. Don't disguise it. Don't clutter it up with a lot of things that are adorning the building. Make it simple. And simple's good, because again, one of our tough challenges, as Pastor said earlier, is money. Simple solves a lot of money problems. So let's try and stay simple with a lot of those things. You see a lot of interesting shapes, a lot of interesting graphics. Again, showing some life on the outside of the building. A lot of churches, particularly in this area, you live in a unique climate. I go work in Minnesota, I go work in Florida. I made the mistake of going to Florida and thinking they lived in the ideal outdoor climate. 5 months a year, tops. The rest of the time, they are hunkered down on the inside, just like they do in Minnesota. But in Southern California, linking active life on the outside of the building is as important as anything that goes on the inside of the building. They want to see that connection on the outside of the building. We designed by charrette. Charrette is a word that is a clue to architects. We learned that word in college. It's the French word for little chariot. And in the original schools of architecture, they used to roll the little chariot through the studio, and if your drawing was not on the little chariot or the little cart, you received a failing grade. So for architects, it means get to it. Get the right people around the table, make decisions, and get to it. And so we are oftentimes, in our situations, is we come to your location and design by charrette. I've recently finished 3 or 4 charrettes down here in Southern California. What we do is we have the church gather together. There's a little homework stage that occurs ahead of that. But it's really a gathering together of the people that have a perspective on the ministry and the outreach of the church and the inreach of the church to help us understand the ethos of the church. And then we get busy. And during that 3-day time period, we're coming up with the solutions for the project. So I'll kind of walk through a little bit about how that happens. But the millennial generation is very much wanting to participate in that sort of an experience. That's very important for them. So we try to encourage the folks that we're working with, don't isolate yourselves. We understand that the preponderance of the funds for these kinds of projects are coming from an older generation. Don't just invite that older generation. Allow the younger folks to come in, and let's allow and facilitate the discussion between older and younger people during the course of that charrette. The older folks need to hear from the younger people and vice versa. One interesting thing about this generation, this younger generation, millennials, they want to be mentored. My generation, exactly the opposite. Get me out of here. I don't want to be mentored. I know more. I know better. Your generation, I don't want any part of it. This generation, they want that intergenerational activity, and a charrette is a great format for that to happen. One of the things that's interesting about this generation is the whole notion of what they call mash-up culture, the blending of disparate things, bringing things together. That's a concept that we see in the retail world. We see it in the clothing world where somebody will walk in with a absolutely trashed pair of jeans. I mean, jeans purposely made with holes in them. I still can't get past that. Jeans that have holes in them on purpose. That's got to shorten the life of the pair of jeans. Maybe that's a brilliant marketing strategy, but a pair of jeans that are trashed and then a $1 million top of some sort. That sort of disparate bringing together of two things that don't look like they belong really works for this organization or this age group. In terms of exterior types of things, the whole notion of using imaging and projection over the top of surfaces has become very, very popular. In fact, we've seen some churches who are able to take imaging and cast imaging over at nighttime on the outside of a very staid, old, institutional-style building and really bring life and vitality to that whole facade. They like to play with history, the whole notion of playing with history. There's a good example of actually putting an image over the top of what would be considered very institutional and bringing that building to life for a period of time, allowing people to do a double take. That's very interesting to this millennial mindset. Repurposing existing facilities. You can see some examples here on the lower portion of a very, very old traditional church. I mean, hundreds of years old, an old stone church where they've taken that glass facade and done something very contemporary in context of the older building. This generation is not fleeing older buildings, but they want to know that there's something different about that older building. Change it for us, tweak it for us, do something different here. Don't just give us the same old thing, because we don't want to walk in and subject ourselves to the same old church. We want something different. We want the link to the past, but we want something different. The building on the right, you see that monolithic building with what I used to call parasitic architecture. It looks like something growing off the side of the building. That's very conducive to this generation, is that notion of bringing two disparate things together, that mash-up culture. Another aspect that we want to talk about is the whole notion of social connection. Social connection for this generation is not just important, they are insisting on this generation, my generation, of being brought into that, and so providing space. And so the older buildings that oftentimes churches find themselves in are not suitable for social connection. The narthex, or the little preparation space ahead of worship, people will come into, they take their jacket off, they shake the rain off or the snow. Maybe not in Southern California, you don't have those kind of problems, but it's a very small space. You go into worship, and then you come back out and you go home. And in years in the past, in traditional times of the past, you saw each other all week long. That doesn't happen in today's world. You may get in the car and drive 20 miles away, and you're not going to see the rest of the people, so you need to provide space where social interaction can be encouraged. This says 43% have texting as a substitute for actual conversation. Well, I know for a fact that number's got to be about 90%. I think that statistic is old. I do know that a few years ago, when my youngest daughter first got her first phone, I think we put her off till she was about 17 or 18, and she finally got a phone. We handed her the phone, and I would try calling her, and I would just constantly be leaving messages. She doesn't answer the phone. She responds to texts, and I had to learn very quickly how to text. I had committed, I will never text, until I realized I'd never talk to my daughter again if I didn't do that. So I had to relearn the way that I do things. The design implications are for us is the whole creation of third place. Is that the first place is your home, second place is where you work, third place is where you go to find community. Every Saturday morning for 17 years, I've gone down to the coffee garden, which is near my house, and I've met with the same 4 guys, and we talk about what's been going on this week, what's going on with our families. We pray for one another. I've been doing that for 17 years. The coffee garden is where I go to find my community. Well, churches have figured out is we can make our church third place. We can make it the place where people link and click into community. And it's very important for us to think about how do we work with that kind of a space? How does that happen? So we're very intentional about creating flexible space where people can come together. A fifth aspect is keeping things real. Millennials prefer brands with a unique and authentic story to tell. You know, this illustration on the lower right, I don't know, have you ever heard the phrase "get chucked" before? You know where that phrase comes from? That pair of shoes is the pair of shoes I wore from 1961 to 1974, everywhere. They're Chuck Taylors. Chuck Taylor was some old guy that played in the NBA back in the 40s, and when they first came up with these shoes, Chuck Taylor was the guy. Well, now that's been transitioned. That linkage to an authentic story of the past has made this shoe brand resurge. It's become extremely important in today's culture. So that whole notion of branding and linking, forming some kind of a link where they can own that is very, very important. They almost wear it like a badge. Church design, too, needs to highlight the organization's personality, and it has to communicate. We just did a youth center or a children's center down in Umatilla, Florida. I don't know if you've ever been to Umatilla, Florida. It's in the center part of the state, a good distance from Orlando, a good distance from everything, and there's nothing there but hog hunting and alligator chasing. And they are hunters and to the max, and so their whole kids area is filled with stuff that is endemic to who they are. They have camouflage doors. They have all the paraphernalia around there that reflects who they are. That's very important for those parents to know that my church is who we are. So that the color schemes, the whole thing that attracts people into that facility, at the surface, again, not the relationships, but at the surface, are the aesthetic aspects that form the linkage to the identity that they carry. Really important for us to be thinking about how that happens. These kinds of spaces are opportunities for us to be thinking about that sort of thing. They need to reflect the local culture and the history, and for us, that's oftentimes, one of our challenges during the charrette time is to really understand that. Well, now we've worked around the nation so often and so much that we have a really good regional feel for how that works. It's changing too. I mean, we're seeing that change on a daily basis. This building on the lower right is a building that we did on a 92-acre site in Ames, Iowa. You can stand on the top of this building and look to the southwest, the southeast, the northeast, not the northwest because that's where the city of Ames is, but you can see corn as far as the eye can see. And that is their culture, is that they're agrarian, they're agricultural. And so bringing in forms and materials, that galvanized siding material was a form that particular group feels very, very comfortable with. And for this younger culture, it formed a connection to their core identity. Really important for us to be thinking about how that's going to work. I'm going to turn the subject a little bit to master planning for financial stability and sustainability. This culture that I've talked about, this millennial generation, has come in, and they're not a culture that substitutes money. In fact, in 2010, 90% of church income came largely from the baby boomer generation, which made a lot of sense because the baby boomers were plentiful, they were at their peak earning years, they're workaholics, they have money, they have affluence, and they give money in lieu of service. And so they largely filled the needs of the church budgets, and the millennials had really not started to come to their own financially. Now, millennials, by the way, we're defining those born between 1980 and about the year 2000. So in 2010, they were, 30 years old? So they're just coming into form. They're getting out of college, they're starting their jobs, they're starting to progress. Well, the baby boomers started retiring in 2010 at the rate of about 10,000 plus per day. This younger generation is coming in, but they're not going to church, so they're not there in the same numbers, and they don't look upon giving in the same way that the previous generations have done. And so churches need to be thinking hard about the way that buildings get built. My partner Dan will say that churches are probably some of the most poorly used worst stewardship facilities in the nation, with the exception of maybe NFL stadiums, which get used 8 or 9 times a year. They put 100,000 people in the stadium, but a church will oftentimes sit fallow, but for 5 hours a week. Maybe the church staff has an office back in the building somewhere, but for the most part, the church facilities are not getting used. And there's been a thinking in the past that the church facility should not be the source of revenue. Well, we have found that churches can accomplish a number of goals, and we're going to talk about some of those goals this morning. First of all, I think it's important for churches to think a little bit differently about the whole notion of not-for-profit versus profit. The reason is because the government's making you think that way. Oregon has already shifted. They're already paying huge amounts of property tax. Washington has also changed that. California will be on the ballot in the next few years. And whatever happens in California is going to sweep across the rest of the nation. So there's been a understanding on the part of the government that there's going to be a change in the way that we think about church facilities and their access to a not-for-profit status. So we need to think about that and understand the way that that works. Profit is not an ugly word. We can think about that in a very different way, especially when we're thinking about profit, being able to link that to ministry and stewardship. So the key for that we see in the near future is to identify new revenue streams and to recognize the change in the way that churches have gathered income in the past for the ministries of the church. So we'll explore some of those. There's basically 5 opportunities for financial stability in the 21st century. The first is land. Land is something that oftentimes churches have tremendous amounts of resources in, and it's oftentimes underutilized. We've worked with churches all over the nation that have huge amounts of acreage, and their answer to that acreage is that we'll just plant it full of athletic fields and a picnic shelter or something like that. But land can be a tremendous resource, especially if the land has ample amounts of parking on it. That parking is probably going to sit fallow most of the time. People won't be using it except for Sunday mornings. And so the cost, as you mentioned, Pastor, this morning, the costs are shifting in building projects. It used to be that we used to ascribe about 15% of the cost of a project towards site development. In this area, it's about the same as the building cost. Your land cost and your site development were comparable to the same cost that it cost to build all of these buildings. Those percentages have changed, and that's a huge equity investment that an organization has towards other uses for that property, and it can represent substantial amounts of equity. The developers want land for recreation and sports fields, for senior housing, for meeting facilities, for office space, for retail space, all of those things. And all of those things can form linkages to the ministry themselves. They gain equity, developers gain equity through leasing land, through the infrastructure. Just the cost of bringing in the site utilities is huge for a lot of churches. The site drainage aspects, dedicating land for placing water as it's draining off the site. And you can gain 30%. We've actually seen some extreme forms where it's more than 30%, and that's a huge contribution towards any development project. So it's a good platform from which the church can operate from. There's ways that we think that we can creatively share existing buildings. And there's ways that we can form linkages, again, in that sharing to bringing people into our ministry as that's happening. So we'll talk about some of the specifics. This was a church that came to us, that we actually did their building in the lower right-hand corner some years ago in Joshua, Texas. And they came to us, they said, well, we're trying to develop a vision for our land, and we think that we'd like to have a baseball field and 2 soccer fields, and someday we want to have a small school inside of our existing church building. But we're going to utilize the rest of this 25-acre, 26-acre parcel for fields. And so while we were down there talking to them, we realized that like 2.5, 3 blocks down the road, the city had an unbelievable number of developed fields already, and they were being underutilized. Their notion was, we're going to build a better mousetrap, and we're going to attract people to our church site. Well, you're not just incurring the cost of developing that land for those fields, which is expensive nowadays, but we're also going to incur the cost of maintaining those fields. And it didn't seem like the best use of the land. So it turned out that there were some people in the church organization that were actually developers, and we got them involved in thinking creatively about the way that it was coming together. And we placed senior housing in the upper part of it. We placed a assisted living center and then a more intensive living center for people that are going through the stages of assisted living and so forth. Businesses on the left-hand side, some of them medically related because of the relationship to the senior housing. We did plan a school on that property. We did plan a community center on that property. All of a sudden, all the things on that land besides fields made a lot of sense to them. And so, as it turns out, the pro forma was put together by the developers in the organization in the church. And these are men whose business savvy is how to develop and create things. They had just never linked how do we do this for the church. And so they figured out a way that after a 20-year period of time, after the pro forma had come to fruition and the profit had been made on the project, how the facility ownership reverts to the church. And they showed on paper how the church can receive $10 million in income per year from the profit derived from these projects. Think what a church can do from a mission standpoint with $10 million a year. Now all of a sudden you're thinking differently. These are not substitutes for tithing. These are not so that we don't have to give money. This is a wiser way to use the resources that God has given to us and recognizing the change in the dynamics of giving. This project up in Prairie Oaks, Minnesota, there's a huge need in this community for indoor athletic space, indoor lacrosse, indoor basketball, and multi-use type space. Well, they came to us and said, we've got 40 acres of land. This is a congregation of 250 people, by the way. We have 40 acres of land. There is no chance that this local city is going to have the ability to build anything within the next 10 years. They are so far underwater financially, they'll never build this, but they have a huge need for it. We've talked to them, and they are, through some development organization in our own church, some guys that have done this professionally in the past, they are willing to form a long-term lease with us and allow us to develop this building and lease this building for 20 years. And we're going to go ahead and build this. So this church of 250. The church will utilize that. Thank you. The church will use that performing arts facility as their church, and they're going to populate the building throughout the week. They have a child care location in the church or in the building because they need to have that for their church. They're also during the week going to make that a place where people who are coming to use the athletic facilities can drop off their kids and be exposed to the ministries of the church. So now the church is infusing them. What they've essentially done is they've built a community center. This is their community center. And they've got a running track in there. They've got 2 large lacrosse courts. They've got seating for 3,000 people around a feature court. They have a huge concert facility. So now they're setting up concert arrangements for Christian artists to come, so on and so forth. And they have governance over the way that the facility is being used, so it's not used inappropriately. This is the facility I was talking about over in Chula Vista, where the pastor said, how many different ways can we utilize this facility? So they use it for sports leagues, they use it for wedding receptions, they use it for exercise yoga classes, they use it for taekwondo classes, they use it for scouts, you name it. And some of those classes pay a fee. Not a large fee, but they pay a fee to utilize the facility because there is a cost to using that facility. And so in some regard, they are subsidizing the building, the construction of the building. Well, while they're there for a yoga class, they get a flyer on a connection to a parenting class on Saturday morning. The yoga class is not a ministry of the church, but the parenting class is. Now all of a sudden there's a connection point for them to come to church. They've walked into the building, they've learned something about the organization through the parenting class, and now there's a connection to hear the gospel of Christ. Very interesting. And the church has figured out that we can populate our building all week long and make good use of this building. All of a sudden there's a stewardship aspect that makes sense. They've become a de facto community center. They've linked themselves to community. Again, important financially and important for this younger generation. Forming connection to community. Not just the internal community, not just us, I got mine, but the outside community. A church up in Oregon, when the taxes changed on property tax in Oregon, this church got hit with $200,000 of expense that they didn't plan on for their church budget. So they turned their facility by necessity into a conferencing center. And they did it primarily because people inside the church who were running companies of their own needed a place for training. And so they had to have a place where they could put 1,000 people in a room. Well, now they've gone through 3 months of gaining $25,000 to $30,000 worth of income per month by leasing their facility out. And it's exposed these folks coming in for something totally unrelated to church to the church. So it's, again, they've formed linkages. Well, now they've changed the name from New Beginnings to Anthem, and now they have the Anthem Church and they have the Anthem Conferencing Center. And in fact, BGW now has an events planner who is helping them understand all the myriads of ways and marketing methods that they can use for other ways to form connections to their community. How do we not only find people to lease the facility, but how do we form a connection between the church and those that choose to lease this facility? How do we do that? That's the beginning of sowing the seeds of gospel for a lot of these organizations that come in. Again, New Hope Community Church, 1,200 non-church members each week using that facility. Church up in Escondido, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, has learned that they can share this facility with two church organizations that don't celebrate their Sabbath on Saturday. Their church was sitting idle on Sunday, and they've largely taken care of a major portion of their cost to build the building. Not just the cost to build the building, but they also made a contribution of about $5 million to their city up there. And they had huge amounts of expenses to overcome. Well, they've realized that we can use this for a lot of other things. We'll talk a little bit about this whole notion of man cave in just a minute. Let's see, are we going to go to the next one? I don't think we are. This must be a new slide, Tobias. I haven't seen this slide.
I haven't either.
Well, I can talk about it because I know Judy Jackson. Judy Jackson is an event planner that's come into our organization that has become here we are in architecture, construction, miscellaneous organization, fundraising, so on and so forth, and now we have an events planner. Who would have thought 5 years ago that we would have an events planner? But now it makes sense because this is the next step in the evolution of forming connection to community. She has taught us, we sat down with her when she first came into the organization and went through a step-by-step process about, as designers of churches, of designers of schools, how do we need to think differently about the flow of people for the kinds of things you're talking about? And she helped us understand, here's the things that I would change about the way you're thinking. Here's the way that we can accomplish this while we're accomplishing this, so that we can hold weddings in a space like this. Weddings that brides not just want to be crammed into and forced fit into, but that really want to come to a facility like this. We're doing a project right now down in Jacksonville, North Carolina, right across the street from Camp Lejeune. Camp Lejeune is a Marine camp that has 70,000 intakes a year. So these kids come in, they join the Marines, and this church has come to us and said, Discovery Church, we don't want a church building. We need to have our needs met from a church. And I attended their services. I saw how they did church. What we need a community center building and help us understand how the flow of people coming in for as wide a number of events as possible. We can hold real estate training events in this building 5 or 6 times a year. We can fill the building with real estate agents. We can hold these marine balls. One of the big hurdles for them was these fellas drink. They have alcohol, and you're not going to hold a marine ball in a building That's a church building. They said, we're not building a church building. We're building a community center, and the church is going to be using this building on the weekends, on Wednesday nights. We're building a community center. Think of it as a community center. Show us how to do a community center. And we want something that works for the church, by the way. And we want to be able to talk to people about how the church works. When the real estate agents come in, we're going to open up our daycare in our elaborate playground space for the kinds of things that these real estate agents are going to need. And we're going to let them know about who we are on the weekends. That's the kind of thing that we want to think about. So thinking broadly about that. The whole notion of thinking about the meeting point. We're now designing buildings that are simply built around the idea of bringing people together, from which the gospel of Christ is spread. That's the sort of thing we want to be talking about. This is one that's being planned for North Point and Joshua that I talked about just a few minutes ago. Coffee shops are important. The kinds of meeting spaces are going to be important. Private equity funding is something that we have to be thinking about carefully as we're doing this. Basically, there's three kinds of money. There's living expenses, there's discretionary funds, and there's rainy day retirement funds. Churches ought to be targeting this third category on here for the kinds of things that would be important for the development of a project. The kinds of things that work well for these kinds of development opportunities, playground equipment. A church up in Minnesota we have worked with that built a playground, indoor playground 10 years ago. It's largely subsidized by birthday parties. That playground is, somebody from the church mentioned to us that they are getting somewhere in the neighborhood of $300,000 to $400,000 per year in income from the continual use of that space as playground space. It also happens to be the primary entry point for young families into their church. People come there for a birthday party, totally disconnected from the church. Their kids seem to enjoy it, and their next step is, this would be kind of a cool place to come to church. And so they've turned that playground not just into a playground that gets used for 45 minutes on a Sunday morning or an hour on a Wednesday night, but a space that is a cross-fertilization area for the community. The whole notion of mechanical and electrical upgrades, that's radically changed with tax law changes in the past 2 years. Churches can actually have somebody privately finance this and make money off of upgrading their fixtures and totally revamp. We just did this in our building. We have a 25,000 square foot building in Ogden, and we just went through this exercise and pocketed $29,000 profit in the course of doing this, and our electrical expenses are going to be a small fraction of what they were before, largely because of the less use of power, but the demand charges have gone way down, something in California that's hugely important. So these are all projects that can be privately funded. Solar panels, 5 years ago, every church committee in America was saying, are we going to put solar panels on our building? And my answer was, no, we can't afford it, we can't afford it, we can't afford it. Someday, maybe. Well, that time has come because the tax laws have changed, and you can get that stuff added to your building for no or low cost. And the payback to the development organization within the church or aside from the church is a profit-making venture for them, but for the church, they don't have the power bills to deal with anymore. All that stuff has gone down, and the tax laws have changed to make that a good example. This solar energy example, the private equity investor, who could be a member of the church or not, is purchasing the system for the church. They're leasing to the church for 10 years. They're the ones receiving the solar tax credits. Up till now, churches haven't cared about tax credits. They may in the future because of the changing nature of taxing churches, but they haven't cared about them. They need an entity who cares about tax credits. They get to write off increase by 50% and then eventually owning the system. That makes sense when we form linkages to those kinds of entities, those kinds of private equity entities. It makes sense in our new projects. It makes sense in our existing buildings. We talked, I mentioned in one of the slides, too, something about the whole notion of man caves. I don't know if you've heard this trend that's sweeping the nation about man caves. We got together a few months ago. These are spaces, I think this is kind of born out of the idea that men have been trampled into the ground culturally in the United States. Men have been mocked and made fools of in media and television, and in some cases maybe deservedly so. But in any event, the churches are understanding the fact that today 61% of adult population is female, 39% male. Men don't feel comfortable in church. A lot of times it's because they've relegated some of the aesthetic decisions to the gals in the church. I went into a church recently in Britt, Iowa. I walked into the church and they said, we need to totally revamp this space. We want a new third place space, a coffee bar over here, this over here. We want to change this, we want to change that. But by all means, make sure you don't do anything to what's inside this room. We need to make sure we preserve what's inside this room, because I as the pastor, have made a commitment to these ladies that we're not going to touch this room. And I went over there and the door was locked. He unlocked the door for me. He opened up the door, and inside this room, 20 feet by 20 feet, maybe 400 square feet, racks of silk plants. It looked like a giant funeral parlor. Well, that's the culture of the church in America. Especially in small-town Iowa, that's the way it is. No wonder men don't feel comfortable. Now, in small-town Iowa, they don't have much choice. They're going to church, and that's the way it's going to be for a little while. But in big-time America, that's not the case, and men aren't going to church. And churches have figured out we better reclaim our men. So they started out creating these spaces, you know, the man cave shows that you've seen on TV for your house. Well, churches are doing that now. Well, we got together with our millennials in our company and started talking about creating man caves, and they said, you know, that's not something we'd really do. That's not something that appeals to us. If we're going to watch a football game, we're going to go to so-and-so's house. They've got better TVs anyway, and we'll go to a sports bar. We're not going to go to church to watch a sports game. So the man cave doesn't really work. What really works for us, give us a little bit of time. So they went off and isolated themselves and brainstormed for some period of time and came back with illustrations and ideas. They had a sheet of about 20 different ideas. They said, what we want is integration with the older men of the church. Give us a place where we can be project-oriented, where we can put a bicycle on a work stand, where we can put a motorcycle on a work stand, where we can take things apart, where we can learn things from the older guys in the church and vice versa, and integrate with some of the older guys in the church. But don't make us do that with chairs sitting around a circle talking about our relationships. That's not the way they're geared. That's not the way men are geared. Give us an activity room. Give us a place where people can come together and we can integrate and forge relationships. And that's the beginning point of younger guys and older guys getting together and beginning to have a discipling-styled relationship. Well, that space can also be a green room that we can use for backstage. We can multi-purpose that kind of space. It doesn't have to be a single-purpose space. So these guys started putting together illustrations. Now we're building one in our office so we can show churches this is the way that it ought to be set up. There's a lot of checker plate in this space, a lot of materials, raw concrete materials, so on and so forth. It's basically a shop-type space. It's a shop environment that you can walk over and get a cup of coffee in or serve a sandwich in or something like that. Simple spaces where men can come together. And that's going to be an attraction for this generation of people. So those are a few ideas that we have touched on. We are learning from the churches that have done this right and have showed us. We are learning from a younger generation that is showing us how to be thinking intelligently about these kinds of things. And that's the sort of thing that this organization, I think, has been known for, is that as we've gone along, we've seen non-stewardship approaches towards fundraising. We've got to solve that. We've seen non-stewardship approaches towards purchasing materials. We've got to solve that. We've seen non-stewardship approaches towards forging conflict relationships with contractors. We've got to solve that. For us, that's the means by which we can begin to make a sensible approach in a stewardship manner, in a ministry manner towards these projects. So